There's a poison moving through your bloodstream right now, and you didn't take it on purpose. Nobody handed you a glass and said, "Drink this." It seeped in slowly. One scroll, one comment, one bad relationship, one 2 a.m. doubt at a time. And here's the part that should scare you. You've been calling it normal. Stop for 1 second and ask yourself something. When was the last time you went 24 hours without a single thought that made you feel smaller? Not a bad day. Not a rough patch. Just smaller. If you can't remember, that's not a coincidence. That's contamination. Here's a belief you've probably never questioned, that a busy mind is just the price of a modern life. That anxiety is baseline. That comparing yourself to strangers on a screen is simply what Tuesday feels like now. What if that's not true at all? What if the exhausted, foggy, self-critical version of you isn't the real you? It's a version running on hijacked software. Somewhere between the life you're living and the life you actually want. There's a filter clogged with years of sludge nobody ever taught you to clean. And by the time this audiobook ends, you're gonna know exactly how to clear it. Not with affirmations taped to a mirror, but with a real, repeatable system. Stick with me. What you learn in the next few hours might be the most important maintenance you ever perform on yourself. The mind. Nobody taught you to think about your morning routine. You probably brushed your teeth without thinking twice. Maybe you showered, put on deodorant, laced up your shoes. You've been trained since childhood to take care of your body's hygiene automatically, without needing motivation or willpower. Nobody has to convince you to wash off the day's grime. You just do it, the same way you breathe, without negotiation. Now ask yourself, who ever taught you to clean your mind with the same consistency? Nobody did. And that gap, the space between how carefully we maintain our bodies and how carelessly we neglect our thoughts, is exactly why so many capable, intelligent, hard-working people stay stuck in the same patterns year after year. It's not a talent problem. It's a hygiene problem, just aimed at the wrong organ. Consider Rachel, a marketing manager in Denver. On paper, she was doing everything right. Steady job, supportive husband, a condo with a mountain view. But she told a friend once that her mind felt like a browser with 90 tabs open, and half of them were playing sound she couldn't locate. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't broken. She was mentally polluted, and she didn't have a name for it. She'd wake up already tired, already behind, already bracing for a day that hadn't even started yet. That's what this audiobook is going to give you. A name, a diagnosis, and, more importantly, a cure. Here's the premise we're working from, and it's not mystical. It's biological. Your brain is not a fixed machine you were handed at birth. It's a living, adaptable system that gets shaped by whatever you consistently feed it. Feed it fear, comparison, and noise, and it will build a mental environment optimized for fear, comparison, and noise. Feed it clarity, intention, and truth, and it will build something entirely different. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience, and we'll get into exactly how it works. The people who seem to have it figured out, the ones who stay calm when everything is falling apart, who make confident decisions while everyone else freezes, who seem immune to the noise the rest of us drown in. They didn't win a genetic lottery. They cleaned house. They identified what was polluting their thinking, and they systematically removed it, then replaced it with something stronger. That is a skill, and skills can be learned at any age, starting today, with whatever you're carrying right now. Think of this audiobook less like a lecture and more like a walkthrough of your own house, room by room, with the lights finally turned on. Some rooms you'll recognize immediately. Others might surprise you. A few might make you uncomfortable. And that discomfort is not a warning sign to stop. It's a sign you've found something real. By the end of this journey together, you'll understand the 5 mental patterns quietly running your life without your permission. You'll have completed an honest inventory of your own mental environment. You'll walk away with a 21-day protocol you can start using today, and you'll understand the deeper, long-term systems that keep a clear mind clear for good. Let's begin. The contamination nobody talks about. Here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. Researchers who study cognition estimate the average adult produces somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 distinct thoughts per day. Now, here's the unsettling part. A large majority of those thoughts are repeats. The same worry, the same self-criticism, the same imagined argument, playing on a loop like a song stuck in a scratched groove. And a striking portion of that daily thought traffic leans negative. Picture your mind as a house. Every day, without asking permission, the world delivers packages to your door. Some from social media, some from the news, some from people in your life who mean well but leave a mess behind them anyway. If you never sort the mail, never throw anything out, the house eventually becomes unlivable. Most of us are living in that house. We've just gotten used to stepping over the clutter, rearranging our lives around piles we've stopped noticing are even there. Take Marcus, a firefighter in Phoenix. Physically, the man was a specimen, trained, disciplined, sharp. But he described his mental state to a therapist as static, like a radio caught between 2 stations. He was consuming close to 5 hours a day of news and social feeds, most of it engineered, quite literally by teams of behavioral scientists, to keep his attention locked and his nervous system on alert. He wasn't weak. And he was outmatched by systems built specifically to exploit human attention. He could run into a burning building without hesitation, yet felt paralyzed scrolling through his own phone at midnight, unable to put it down. That's the piece almost nobody says out loud. A significant amount of the mental noise you're carrying wasn't generated by you. It was manufactured. Platforms compete for your attention using the same psychological principles casinos use on slot machines. Variable rewards, infinite scroll, notifications engineered to trigger a small dopamine spike just often enough to keep you checking. News outlets profit more from your fear than your calm, because outrage keeps eyes on screens longer than reassurance ever could. Advertising exists in large part to convince you that the person you already are isn't quite enough yet, because a satisfied customer doesn't need the next product. And underneath all of that sits something even older, the beliefs installed in you before you were old enough to question them. Developmental psychologists who study early childhood conditioning have found that a striking share of adult behavior, how we react under stress, what we believe we deserve, how we talk to ourselves when we fail, was essentially locked in before we ever had the reasoning ability to evaluate whether it was true. In other words, a huge portion of your daily operating system was installed by a version of you too young to give informed consent. A version of you who couldn't yet tell the difference between a parent's bad day and a verdict on your own worth. That might sound bleak. It isn't, because here's the twist. The brain is not concrete. It's clay. Scientists call this neuroplasticity, your brain's lifelong capacity to physically rewire itself based on repeated thought and behavior. The pathways worn deep by years of self-doubt can be worn shallow again, and new pathways for confidence, clarity, and calm can be built in their place no matter your age. A 60-year-old brain can learn, adapt, and rewire just as a 20-year-old one can. The window never closes. It just requires more intentional effort to pry back open. Consider what happens physically when a thought repeats. Every time a specific thought fires, the neurons involved in that thought strengthen their connection to one another. A principle neuroscientists sum up as neurons that fire together, wire together. Think that you're not good enough 1,000 times, and you're not being pessimistic. You're literally building a superhighway in your brain dedicated to that exact belief. Think a different thought 1,000 times, and you build a different highway instead. Neither is fixed. Both are choices repeated. This isn't about blind positivity, and it never will be in this audiobook. Toxic positivity, forcing a smile over real pain, is its own kind of pollution. This is about accuracy. Most of the negative loops running through your mind aren't accurate reflections of reality. They're outdated alarm systems, old survival code, or borrowed fears that were never yours to carry in the first place. Detoxing your mind doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. It means clearing out the noise so you can actually see what's true. So let's identify the culprits one by one. The 5 mental infections. There are 5 specific thought patterns that show up in some combination in nearly everyone who feels stuck. They're not random bad moods. They're systematic, self-reinforcing loops. Mental programs running quietly in the background, shaping decisions you think you're making freely. Learn to spot them and you take away most of their power immediately, because infections that operate best in the dark lose their grip the moment you turn on the light. Infection 1, the comparison loop. You open your phone during a quiet moment and, within 90 seconds, you've absorbed someone's vacation, someone's promotion, someone's seemingly perfect relationship. None of it was meant to hurt you. But it does, because you're comparing your unedited, behind-the-scenes life to someone else's highlight reel. The 3 good seconds out of an otherwise ordinary day that never made it online. Think of a college sophomore named Priya, studying in her dorm in Boston, who found herself spiraling every time she opened a certain app before bed. She wasn't in danger of failing her classes. She was in danger of forgetting that the girl she was comparing herself to was also, somewhere, comparing herself to someone else, in an endless chain of people, measuring themselves against a standard nobody actually meets. Comparison isn't information. It's a hall of mirrors with no exit, and the only way to leave it is to stop walking through the door in the first place. Here's the deeper trap. The comparison loop convinces you that your worth is a competitive score, ranked against strangers. But worth was never supposed to be measured against someone you've never met, whose struggles you've never seen, whose story you only get in carefully chosen fragments. Infection 2, the perfection trap. This one wears a disguise. It looks like high standards, but it's actually fear wearing a nice outfit. It whispers that unless the work is flawless, it isn't worth finishing. So the project stays in drafts. The business idea stays in a notebook. The application never gets submitted, not because it isn't good enough, but because good enough was never actually the standard being applied. A software engineer named David in Seattle spent 11 months polishing an app he never released, terrified that one bug would prove he didn't belong in the industry. Meanwhile, 3 less talented competitors shipped rough, imperfect versions and improved them in public, learning from real users instead of imagined critics. Perfectionism doesn't produce better work. It produces less work, wrapped in the comforting illusion of high standards, protecting the person underneath from ever being judged on something they actually finished. Perfectionism often traces back to a simple, painful equation learned early. Love and approval were conditional on performance. Mistakes weren't treated as part of learning. They were treated as evidence of inadequacy. So the adult version of that child avoids mistakes at all costs, which ironically means avoiding almost everything worth attempting. Infection 3. The victim script. This is the quiet belief that your circumstances are permanent and someone or something else is responsible for fixing them. It's seductive because it removes the weight of responsibility from your shoulders. But there's a hidden cost. Whatever you hand your responsibility to, you also hand your power to. This doesn't mean real obstacles don't exist. They absolutely do, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. Discrimination is real. Bad luck is real. Unfair systems are real. The victim script is different. It's the story that says nothing can change, so nothing is worth attempting. And that story, repeated enough times, becomes a self-fulfilling one, because a person who has stopped trying will never discover what might have been possible. Consider two people who lose the same job on the same day. One spends 6 months explaining, to anyone who will listen, exactly why the economy, the boss, and the industry are to blame. The other spends that same 6 months updating a resume, reaching out to contacts, and building a new skill. Both have a legitimate grievance. Only one of them is still moving. Infection 4. The scarcity reflex. This is the belief that there isn't enough to go around. Not enough money. Not enough opportunity. Not enough recognition. So, someone else's win must somehow be your loss. It breeds quiet resentment instead of inspiration, and it makes people hoard knowledge and connections instead of sharing them, terrified that helping someone else means losing ground themselves. The truth, backed by basic economic reality, is that value creation isn't fixed like a pie with a set number of slices. New markets, new ideas, and new relationships are being created constantly. A colleague's raise doesn't shrink your paycheck. A friend's happy marriage doesn't reduce your odds of finding one. Scarcity in the mind is almost always a story, not a fact, though it can certainly feel like one when you're anxious about your own progress. People operating from genuine abundance tend to share more freely, mentor more generously, and celebrate other people's wins more easily. Not because they're naturally generous, but because they've stopped believing someone else's success comes at their expense. That shift alone tends to open more doors than it closes, because people notice who roots for them and who quietly doesn't. Infection 5. The instant reward circuit. This is the pattern that craves immediate payoff and treats any delay as unbearable. It's why the phone gets picked up instead of the book, why the show gets streamed instead of the workout getting done. Technology has trained an entire generation's brain to expect gratification within seconds. And when real, worthwhile goals don't deliver that fast, the instant reward circuit whispers, "Quit, this isn't working. Try something else instead." But nothing that actually matters moves at that speed. Every relationship worth having, every skill worth mastering, every business worth building requires tolerating a gap between effort and reward. That tolerance is a trainable muscle, and like any muscle, it strengthens with repeated, deliberate use and weakens the same way through neglect. Recognize any of these in yourself? Good. That recognition is not a failure. It's the first sign the detox has already begun. Most people carry 2 or 3 of these 5 at once, often without realizing they're connected. The comparison loop feeding the perfectionism trap, the scarcity reflex feeding the victim script. Untangling one often loosens the others. And honest, look in the mirror. Before any real change can happen, you need an honest inventory. Not a comfortable one, an honest one. Cleaning what you refuse to see is impossible. So here are the questions. Don't answer with what sounds good. Answer with what's true, even if what's true is uncomfortable to admit out loud. How much of your internal dialogue today has been critical, worried, or fearful? Really sit with that. Most people, when they pay close attention for even 1 hour, are startled by how relentless the inner commentary actually is, a running critique they'd never let anyone else deliver to them out loud. How many hours a day do you spend consuming content that leaves you feeling worse, anxious, inadequate, agitated, rather than better? Add it honestly, including the small pockets throughout the day you might normally not count. Most people underestimate this number by half, sometimes more. Who are the 5 people whose voices you hear most often, whether in person or in your feed? Are they building you up or quietly wearing you down? You become an average of the inputs you allow closest to you. That's not a proverb. It's closer to a law of psychology, confirmed again and again in research on social influence and emotional contagion. What is the story you tell yourself about your own limits? I'm too old for this. I don't have the right background. People like me don't get opportunities like that. Write those sentences down exactly as they run through your head. Seeing them on paper, outside your skull, often reveals how flimsy they actually are. Sentences that sound almost absurd once they're not just echoing silently in the dark. How do you talk to yourself after a mistake? Would you ever speak to a close friend the way you speak to yourself in that moment? If the honest answer is no, you found one of your biggest leaks, a double standard that quietly drains confidence every single day, it goes unnoticed. How do you typically respond to criticism or setbacks? Do you extract the lesson and move forward, or do you replay it for days, turning one bad moment into a week-long emotional hangover? Your answer here says a great deal about the current strength of your mental immune system. And finally, do you generally take ownership of your outcomes, or do you find yourself reaching for an external explanation first? Neither answer makes you a bad person, but only one of those 2 habits tends to lead somewhere better. This isn't an exercise in guilt. Guilt keeps you stuck. Awareness moves you forward. You cannot clean a room you refuse to walk into. So walk in, turn on the light, and look. That's the whole job of this chapter, nothing more and nothing less. The 21-day Reset Neuroscience research on habit formation consistently points to roughly 3 weeks of consistent repetition as the threshold where a new pattern starts to feel less like effort and more like identity. This protocol is built around that window, broken into 3 phases of 7 days each, moving from subtraction to addition to rewiring. Phase 1, days 1 through 7. Clear the clutter. This phase is about subtraction, not addition. For the first 3 days, go on a deliberate information diet. Remove or hide the apps that pull your attention without giving anything back. Stop consuming news in its rawest, most reactive form. The version designed to trigger outrage rather than inform. Mute accounts, feeds, or group chats that consistently leave you feeling worse. This isn't permanent. Think of it as clearing the counter before you cook, not renovating the whole kitchen overnight. Expect some genuine discomfort here. If you're used to reaching for your phone dozens of times a day, the first few days of a real information diet can feel closer to withdrawal than relaxation. That reaction is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign of exactly how deep the habit had grown. For days 4 through 7, turn that same decluttering instinct on your physical space. A cluttered desk and a cluttered inbox create low-grade cognitive noise you've simply stopped noticing. The mental equivalent of a low hum you've learned to tune out, but that's still draining energy in the background. Clear it. At the same time, start setting quiet boundaries with people who consistently bring chaos or negativity into your day. You don't need a dramatic confrontation, just less access to your attention delivered with simple, calm consistency. Phase 2, days 8 through 14. Feed the system well. Removing junk isn't enough on its own. Your mind, like your body, needs quality input to replace what it's lost. For days 8 through 10, swap raw news consumption for a well-reported book or a podcast that actually teaches you something. Swap a scrolling session for a documentary that expands rather than drains you. Notice how different the fatigue feels afterward, informed and full instead of anxious and empty. For days 11 through 14, turn your attention to relationships. Reach out to someone who challenges and supports you rather than someone who simply agrees with everything you say. Consider joining a group, class, or community organized around growth instead of gossip. You're not eliminating people from your life. You're rebalancing who gets the most access to your mental space. The same way you'd rebalance a diet without necessarily cutting anything out entirely. Phase 3. Days 15 through 21. Rebuild the wiring. This final week is where identity level change happens. For days 15 through 17, take the limiting beliefs you wrote down in Chapter 3 and actively build a counter case against each one. Find real evidence, people, facts, precedent, and that contradicts them. Write a new, more accurate belief to replace each old one, and read it aloud daily, out loud, not just silently in your head. For days 18 through 21, lock in the daily habits that will maintain this new baseline. A few minutes of quiet or meditation each morning, a short gratitude note before bed, and a brief evening check-in with yourself about how the day actually went. These small rituals become your maintenance system, the mental equivalent of brushing your teeth, unremarkable on any single day, but decisive over months and years. Throughout all 21 days, hold on to 4 principles. Stay consciously aware of your thought patterns instead of running on autopilot. Be deliberate about what you let into your mind, treating your attention like the valuable, finite resource it actually is. Actively replace removed negativity rather than leaving a void, because an empty space left unattended tends to refill itself with the exact same clutter you just cleared. And above all, stay consistent, because a clean mind, like a clean home, requires upkeep, not a single deep clean followed by years of neglect. Reprogramming the operating system. A 21-day reset clears the surface, but real transformation means going deeper into the beliefs installed long before you had the tools to evaluate them critically. Consider where most of your core beliefs actually came from. Long before you could vote, drive, or hold a job, you were absorbing conclusions about money, worth, love, and possibility from parents, teachers, and culture, often without a single word being spoken directly to you. A tense silence at the dinner table when bills came up. A teacher's offhand comment about who tends to succeed. A parent's exhausted sigh after a long day. These moments become invisible software, running decisions for decades without ever being examined, quietly shaping choices you believe are entirely your own. Some of that early programming protected you as a child. Caution around strangers, for instance, or an instinct to stay quiet during conflict. But protection appropriate for an 8-year-old can quietly sabotage a 38-year-old trying to launch a business or ask for a raise. The wiring meant to keep you safe becomes the wiring that keeps you small, long after the original danger has disappeared. Here's the good news, and it's not a platitude. It's biology. Because of neuroplasticity, none of this wiring is permanent. The process of change follows a clear, repeatable sequence. First, identify the specific limiting belief behind a specific hesitation. When you think about pursuing a goal, notice exactly what thought surfaces first. That automatic reaction is often the belief itself, hiding in plain sight, disguised as simple caution or realism. Second, gather counter-evidence deliberately. If the belief is, "I'm not smart enough for this," go find real examples. people who succeeded without traditional credentials, moments in your own history where you learned something difficult and succeeded anyway. You're not lying to yourself. You're correcting a biased sample, because the mind that formed this belief was working from limited, often unfair evidence in the first place. Third, install a more accurate replacement belief and reinforce it through repetition, visualization, and, most importantly, action. A belief you only think about rarely becomes real. A belief you act on repeatedly becomes identity, because your mind takes its cues far more from what you actually do than from what you merely say to yourself. And identity is the real target here. Most attempts at change fail because people try to force new behavior onto an old self-image. If you privately see yourself as someone who quits, willpower alone won't make you finish things. You'll unconsciously sabotage the effort to stay consistent with the story you believe about yourself. Real change starts by becoming, in small, provable ways, the kind of person who already does the thing you want to do. Not through pretending, but through small, repeated, honest proof. There's also a broader layer worth addressing here. The mental models you use to interpret the world separate from any single belief. If your underlying model of money is scarcity-based, every financial decision will be colored by fear, regardless of how many individual beliefs you update. Upgrading the model itself, studying how people you admire actually think about money, risk, or relationships, often does more long-term work than fixing beliefs one at a time. What mental strength? Actually, well, most people misunderstand mental strength completely. They picture someone who never feels fear, never doubts themselves, never cries. That's not strength. That's suppression. And suppression eventually breaks, often at the worst possible moment. Real mental strength is the ability to feel a difficult emotion fully without letting it drive the car. The strongest people you'll ever meet still feel fear before a big decision. They just don't let the fear make the decision for them. They still feel doubt. They just keep moving anyway, one step at a time, doubt and all. Researchers studying performance across fields consistently find that resilience and grit predict long-term success more reliably than raw talent or IQ. Talented people who quit at the first serious obstacle lose, again and again, to less naturally gifted people who simply refuse to stop. Not because they feel less pain, but because they've built a higher tolerance for pushing through it. Building this kind of strength comes down to a handful of trainable components. Emotional awareness, actually noticing what you feel and why, instead of being blindly driven by it. Catching the trigger before it turns into a 3-day mood. Cognitive flexibility, recognizing that a thought is not automatically a fact and that you can question it rather than obey it without argument. Controlled exposure to discomfort, deliberately choosing manageable challenges so your mind builds real evidence that it can handle hard things rather than avoiding every uncomfortable situation and quietly convincing itself it can't. And a healthy relationship with failure, treating it as data rather than a verdict on your worth, information to adjust course by rather than proof you should stop trying altogether. None of these require a personality transplant. They require reps, the same way a stronger body requires reps. Every time you feel resistance and move through it anyway, in something small. A hard conversation, a cold morning run, an honest piece of feedback delivered face-to-face. You're laying down proof for your own nervous system that you're more capable than your fear claims. Over time, that proof accumulates into something that starts to feel, quite simply, like confidence. Breaking out of the story. You've been told. There's a kind of prison that has no bars, no walls, and no guards, and it's often more effective than any real one, because the person locked inside never tries the door, convinced there isn't one. The bars of this prison are sentences like, "I'm too old for this. I don't have the right connections." People like me don't get chances like that. They feel like facts because they've been repeated so many times they've calcified into something that sounds like common sense. But a repeated thought is not the same thing as a true one, no matter how many years it's had to settle in. The walls are built from single experiences generalized into permanent verdicts. One rejection becomes, "I always get rejected." One failed attempt becomes, "I'm just not built for this." The mind, left unchecked, loves to turn a single data point into an entire life sentence, quietly filing away one bad afternoon as proof about who you fundamentally are. Breaking out starts with recognizing you're the one holding the key. Write down the specific beliefs limiting you, then interrogate each one honestly. Where did this actually come from? Is there real evidence, or just assumption dressed up as fact? Has anyone in similar circumstances achieved what I want? What would be possible if I simply stopped believing this, starting today? Then go find contradictory evidence on purpose. If you believe you're too old to start something new, you don't have to look hard to find people who built extraordinary things well into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. If you believe you need connections you don't have, look for the countless people who built their own from nothing, one honest relationship at a time. This evidence doesn't erase the old belief instantly, but it plants doubt, and doubt is the first crack in any wall, the first sign that the story isn't as solid as it once seemed. Finally, expand your proof through action, not just thought. If you believe you're a poor public speaker, join a local speaking group and give one short talk. If you believe you can't build anything financially, start something small and prove yourself wrong with results, not affirmations. Each new experience becomes a brick removed from a wall you built yourself, and you can just as easily take it apart, one small, deliberate action at a time. And remember, the people around you either reinforce your walls or help you tear them down. Seek out those who've broken through similar limitations. Their existence alone is often the strongest evidence you'll find. The science of a changeable brain. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed the adult brain was essentially fixed. Whatever wiring you had by early adulthood was the wiring you'd carry for life. That belief turned out to be flatly wrong, and its correction is one of the most liberating discoveries in modern neuroscience. Your brain physically reshapes itself based on repeated thought, emotion, and behavior, a property researchers call neuroplasticity. This isn't a motivational slogan. It's measurable, observable biology, confirmed through brain imaging studies that show physical, structural changes in response to sustained new habits. The neural pathways, strengthened by years of anxious thinking, can weaken through disuse, while entirely new pathways for calm, confidence, or focus can form at any age, given consistent repetition. 5 principles govern how this rewiring actually works, and understanding them lets you use the process on purpose instead of by accident. Focused attention strengthens whatever it lands on. Whatever you consistently pay attention to gets neurologically reinforced. Whatever you ignore gradually fades. People who habitually scan for problems get remarkably good at finding them, seeing threats and obstacles everywhere they look. People who train themselves to scan for opportunity get remarkably good at finding that instead. Same world, differently wired lens, same set of facts interpreted through a completely different filter. Emotional intensity accelerates the process. Experiences tied to strong feeling create deeper neural imprints than neutral ones, which is why you remember exactly where you were during a major life event, but can't recall last Tuesday's lunch. This is why vague, half-hearted visualization does little, while vivid, emotionally engaged visualization measurably changes behavior, because the brain responds more strongly to a felt experience than an abstract idea. Progressive challenge builds capacity. A brain consistently given only easy, comfortable tasks optimizes for comfort. A brain consistently given manageable difficulty optimizes for resilience. This is why people who deliberately seek growth tend to handle pressure better over time, not because they were born tougher, but because they train for it. The same way a muscle only grows when asked to carry slightly more than it's used to. Consistency beats intensity. A single burst of motivated effort rarely produces lasting change. Steady, repeated practice does. This is why relying on motivation alone so often fails. Motivation is a mood, and moods are unreliable, arriving and disappearing on their own schedule. Systems and routines outlast moods every time because they don't require you to feel like doing them in order to get done. And finally, environment shapes the brain constantly, whether you're paying attention or not. A chaotic environment trains a chaotic mind. A calm, intentional environment trains a calm, intentional one. This is why changing your surroundings, your information diet, your physical space, the people closest to you, is not a superficial fix. It's neurological architecture, quietly determining what kind of mind you're building day after day, whether you notice it or not. Building a mental immune system. Just as your body needs an immune system to fight off illness, your mind needs one to fight off the constant low-grade contamination of modern life. Without it, you'll keep reabsorbing the same toxins you just spent effort removing, undoing weeks of progress in a single unguarded afternoon. The first line of defense is critical thinking, the simple, consistent habit of asking who benefits from you believing something, whether a claim is backed by evidence or just emotion, and whether a piece of information is actually serving you or quietly manipulating you toward a reaction someone else profits from. The second is emotional regulation. Advertisers, media outlets, and algorithms all profit from triggering strong emotional reactions because a triggered brain buys, clicks, and shares faster than a calm one. Recognizing when your emotions are being deliberately activated and pausing before reacting is one of the most protective habits you can build, turning an automatic reflex into a conscious choice. The third is having a clear set of personal values, because without them, you'll unconsciously absorb whatever values are loudest around you. Knowing precisely what matters to you acts as a filter. Information and influence aligned with those values get let in. Everything else gets screened out before it can take root, before it has the chance to quietly reshape your priorities. The fourth is information hygiene, treated with the same seriousness as physical hygiene. Occasionally fasting from news and social feeds entirely, then reintroducing only high-quality sources gives you a clear before and after sense of how much of your mental noise was externally manufactured rather than internally generated, a contrast most people find genuinely startling the first time they experience it. The fifth is boundaries, protecting your time and attention the way you'd protect any limited, valuable resource. Because the people you spend the most time with quietly shape your baseline mood, ambition, and self-talk more than almost anything else, often more than you'd ever guess from the inside. And the sixth is a clear sense of purpose. People without direction are easy to redirect. People who know precisely what they're building are far harder to distract because every incoming influence gets measured against a clear standard. Does this serve where I'm going or not? A strong enough purpose acts like ballast, keeping you steady even when the surrounding noise gets loud. What the timeline actually looks like. Understanding the real timeline of change matters because most people quit not from lack of progress but from unrealistic expectations about how fast progress should feel. In the first week, expect resistance. Your brain, wired to conserve energy and avoid the unfamiliar, will push back against new patterns. You'll feel pulled toward old habits. This isn't failure. It's your nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do when confronted with change. The goal in this window isn't to feel transformed. It's simply to stay consistent regardless of how you feel, trusting the process even before you can see the results of it. Roughly between days 8 and 21, adaptation begins. Small improvements in mood, focus, and clarity start to appear, and the pull toward old patterns weakens. This is also, ironically, the most dangerous stretch, because feeling slightly better convinces many people they're cured and can relax their new habits. Resist that instinct. The wiring is still forming, not finished, and easing off too early is one of the most common reasons people slide right back to where they started. From roughly 3 weeks to 3 months, integration takes hold. New patterns start to feel less like effort and more like default behavior, but they still require light, ongoing maintenance. The same way brushing your teeth yesterday doesn't excuse skipping it today, no matter how healthy your teeth currently feel. Beyond that, somewhere in the 3-month to 1-year range, what researchers might call mastery becomes possible. A durable baseline of mental clarity and resilience that compounds on itself, because clearer thinking produces better decisions, which produce better outcomes, which reinforce confidence, which sharpens thinking even further in a genuine upward spiral rather than a plateau. Throughout this entire arc, expect setbacks. They're not evidence of failure. They're simply part of a non-linear process. The people who succeed at lasting change aren't the ones who never slip. They're the ones who treat a slip as information and keep going anyway, without turning one bad week into a reason to abandon months of real progress. Track your progress honestly along the way. A simple daily note, energy, focus, and mood, rated on a quick scale, reveals patterns invisible on any single day but obvious across a month, and that longer view is often exactly what keeps people going through the harder stretches. Advanced tools for a trained mind. Once the fundamentals are in place, a handful of advanced techniques, the same ones used by elite athletes, performers, and high-stakes professionals, can accelerate everything. Deliberate mental rehearsal. Vague daydreaming does little, but specific, sensory-rich visualization, seeing the exact room, hearing the exact tone of your own voice, feeling the physical sensation of confidence, activates many of the same neural circuits as the real experience. Athletes who mentally rehearse their performance in vivid detail measurably improve real-world execution. The same principle applies to a difficult conversation, a big presentation, or a hard decision. Rehearse not just the success at the end, but the obstacles along the way, and how you'll handle them calmly when they arise. Deliberate reframing. Circumstances themselves are neutral. The meaning you assign to them is not. A rejection can be interpreted as proof you're inadequate, or as evidence you're one step closer to the right opportunity. Neither interpretation is more true in a strict sense, but one of them moves you forward and one keeps you stuck. Elite performers train themselves to consistently choose the interpretation that builds momentum, not because they're in denial, but because they understand meaning is a choice, not a fact handed to them by circumstances. Controlled stress exposure, deliberately choosing manageable discomfort, a cold shower, a hard conversation, a public speaking opportunity, builds genuine tolerance for pressure over time, the same way controlled exercise builds physical strength. The key word is controlled. This works because the stress is chosen and manageable, not because stress itself is inherently good. Recovery afterward matters just as much as the exposure itself. Attention training through meditation. Meditation, stripped of any mystical framing, is simply focus practice. Choosing a single point of attention, the breath, a word, a sound, and gently returning to it every time the mind wanders builds the exact mental muscle needed for deep work, difficult conversations, and clear decision-making under pressure. Even 5 minutes a day done consistently produces a noticeable difference within a few weeks. Deliberate state management. Your emotional state is shaped by 3 levers you can control directly: your physiology, meaning how you're using your body; your focus, meaning what you're choosing to pay attention to; and your language, meaning the specific words you use with yourself. Change any of the 3. Stand taller, shift your focus, alter your self-talk, and your emotional state shifts with it, often within seconds, because the body and the mind are far more connected than most people give them credit for. Protecting your focus in a world built to steal it deep. Uninterrupted focus has quietly become one of the rarest and most valuable skills a person can have, precisely because the modern environment is engineered to fragment it constantly, one notification at a time. The first shift is monotasking, doing exactly one thing with full attention instead of splitting focus across 5 half-finished tasks. It feels uncomfortable at first, almost like withdrawal, because attention has been conditioned to expect constant novelty. That discomfort fades with practice, usually faster than people expect. The second is scheduling real deep work sessions, blocks of time, ideally 90 minutes or longer, protected from notifications, messages, and interruption, reserved specifically for the kind of thinking that actually moves your goals forward, rather than the shallow, reactive work that fills most modern days. The third is genuine recovery, recognizing that scrolling or passive entertainment does not restore attention. It depletes it further. Real restoration comes from a walk outdoors, an unhurried conversation, physical movement, or quiet stillness. Activities that give the focused attention system an actual chance to recover instead of trading one form of stimulation for another. The fourth is progressive training, treating focus the way you treat a muscle. Start with a duration you can sustain honestly, then extend it gradually over weeks, the same way you'd add weight to a barbell rather than jumping straight to the heaviest plate on the rack. And the fifth is environmental design, removing visual clutter, silencing notifications, and communicating clear boundaries to the people around you, so your focus time is actually respected rather than casually interrupted by anyone who happens to have 5 minutes and a question. The mindset difference between stuck and thriving. There's a specific pattern of thinking that separates people who keep growing from people who plateau, and it has almost nothing to do with raw intelligence. People who keep growing tend to think in systems rather than isolated events. When something goes wrong, they look for the underlying pattern instead of just patching the surface symptom. They think in probabilities rather than certainties, making the best decision they can with incomplete information instead of freezing while waiting for guarantees that will never come. They practice inversion, asking not just what would make this succeed, but what would specifically cause it to fail, so they can design around that risk in advance. Rather than discovering it the hard way, they question inherited assumptions rather than automatically following convention, rebuilding their understanding from first principles when the situation calls for it, instead of simply repeating what everyone else in the room already believes. They think in decades, not days, willing to trade short-term comfort for long-term compounding results that most people never stick around long enough to see. And they hold their conclusions loosely enough to keep learning, treating each new piece of evidence as an invitation to update, not a threat to defend against at all costs. None of this is fixed personality. It's a set of habits available to anyone willing to practice them deliberately, one decision at a time, starting with the very next choice in front of you. Keeping the mind clean. Long-term, getting your mind clear is only half the job. Keeping it that way is the part almost nobody plans for. And it's the difference between a temporary boost and a permanent shift that actually holds. Build a simple daily rhythm, a few honest minutes each morning to set your intention, and a few honest minutes each evening to review what actually happened without judgment, just observation. Regularly audit your surroundings, your physical space, your information diet, your closest relationships, the same way you'd periodically clean out a garage before it quietly fills back up with things you meant to deal with months ago. Keep challenging yourself on purpose because a mind that's never tested plateaus. Exactly like a muscle that's never loaded past its comfort point. Build in real recovery because sustainable performance always requires rest, not just relentless output pushed past the point of diminishing returns. Stay a permanent student, willing to update old conclusions when better evidence shows up, even when that means admitting a belief you held for years turned out to be wrong. And when you can, teach someone else what you've learned. Explaining a principle out loud is one of the fastest ways to cement it permanently in your own thinking, while also passing forward something genuinely useful. What life looks like on the other side. Picture the version of you 6 months from now who has actually done this work, not perfectly, just consistently, showing up for the small daily practices even on the days that felt unremarkable. Decisions that once felt paralyzing start to feel manageable because the mental fog that used to distort them has cleared. Confidence stops depending on outside approval and starts coming from a quieter, steadier place. Proof you've built for yourself through action, not validation collected from strangers online who will never truly know you. Emotions still arrive, fully and honestly, but they no longer drive the car. You feel them and then you choose, with a small but crucial gap between the feeling and the reaction. Focus deepens, allowing hours of real, satisfying work instead of scattered, half-finished effort spread thin across a dozen tabs. Relationships grow more honest because you're no longer performing a version of yourself designed to be liked by everyone, including people whose opinion never actually mattered to your life. Purpose sharpens, cutting out the noise of activities that never actually mattered to you, freeing up time and energy for the things that do. Optimism becomes grounded rather than naive, clear-eyed about real obstacles, while still expecting to find a way through them, because you've already proven to yourself that you can. Creativity opens up, because a mind no longer clenched around fear has room to actually think, to wander, to connect ideas that never would have surfaced under constant pressure. And underneath all of it sits something quieter than happiness, a real, durable peace, the kind that doesn't depend on everything going right. That life is available to you, not through luck, not through a personality transplant, but through the same unglamorous, repeatable maintenance you already give your body every single day. The only question left is whether you'll give your mind the same respect. The people you let in. No chapter on mental contamination would be complete without talking honestly about the people closest to you, because no amount of solo meditation or journaling can outweigh spending 40 hours a week around someone determined to drag you down. Psychologists have a term for this phenomenon: emotional contagion. Moods, attitudes, and even specific thought patterns transfer between people who spend regular time together, often below the level of conscious awareness. Spend enough time around someone who complains constantly, and you'll notice your own inner monologue picking up the same habit, almost like catching a cold you never saw coming. Think about Elena, a nurse in Charlotte who spent years assuming her constant low-grade anxiety was simply part of her personality. It wasn't until she took a 2-week vacation away from her usual social circle that she noticed something strange. The anxiety faded almost entirely. When she returned home and reconnected with a particular friend group, well-meaning people, none of them intentionally harmful, the tight chest and racing thoughts came right back within days. The common factor wasn't her. It was the room she kept walking back into. This doesn't mean cutting people off dramatically or treating every difficult relationship as disposable. Family, in particular, is rarely something you simply discard. But it does mean becoming honest about influence. Ask yourself, for each significant relationship in your life, after time with this person, do I generally feel more capable or less? More hopeful or more drained? Clearer or foggier? The answer doesn't have to be perfect or constant. Every relationship has hard days. But a consistent pattern over months tells you something real. Energy vampires, as they're sometimes called, aren't necessarily bad people. Often they're simply unaware of the weight they're depositing into every conversation. A friend who only calls during a crisis, a coworker who narrates every setback as a catastrophe, a relative who measures every visit by how much sympathy they can extract. You don't need to villainize them. You simply need boundaries, shorter visits, fewer check-ins, less emotional availability during your own vulnerable hours. On the other side of the ledger are what you might call energy multipliers, people who leave you sharper, calmer, and more motivated after even a short conversation. These relationships deserve deliberate investment, not just passive hope that they'll continue on their own. Reach out first. Make the plans. Put in the effort a genuinely valuable relationship deserves, the same effort you'd expect from someone building any other asset worth protecting. And perhaps most importantly, consider what kind of presence you are in other people's mental environments. Detoxing your own mind naturally changes how you show up for others. Less reactive, less draining, more genuinely present. That shift alone tends to upgrade the quality of relationships you attract, because calm, grounded people tend to draw more calm, grounded people toward them, the same way chaos tends to attract more chaos. Designing a life that doesn't need constant detoxing. Everything covered so far has been about cleaning up contamination after it's already accumulated, but there's a more advanced goal worth aiming for. Building a life structured well enough that it doesn't accumulate nearly as much pollution in the first place. Think of the difference between someone who eats poorly for months and then does an aggressive juice cleanse versus someone who simply eats reasonably well most of the time and never needs the dramatic intervention. Both can end up healthy. Only one of them is sustainable without repeated crisis mode. The same principle applies to your mind. Once the 21-day reset and the deeper belief work from earlier chapters have done their job, the real long-term win is designing daily life. So mental pollution has fewer places to enter in the first place. Start with your mornings. The first 30 to 60 minutes after waking set the tone, neurologically and emotionally, for the hours that follow. Reaching immediately for a phone loaded with notifications, headlines, and other people's opinions means outsourcing your mental starting point to whatever algorithm got there first. A short, protected window before screens, even 5 or 10 minutes of quiet, stretching, or simply looking out a window, gives your own mind first claim on your morning instead of surrendering it by default. Look next at your physical spaces. A workspace cluttered with unfinished tasks visually represented everywhere you look creates a subtle, constant hum of unfinished business your brain never fully relaxes around. A bedroom filled with screens and work materials blurs the boundary your mind needs between rest and effort. Small, deliberate separations, a designated space for focused work, a bedroom reserved primarily for actual rest, do more for baseline mental clarity than most people expect from something so simple. Consider your calendar as a mental environment in its own right. A schedule crammed edge to edge with obligations, with no buffer between meetings or tasks, guarantees a background hum of low-grade urgency all day long. because there's never a moment to actually process what just happened before the next thing demands attention. Building in small, deliberate buffers, even 10 minutes between commitments, gives your mind room to reset instead of running in a constant, cumulative sprint. And finally, revisit your defaults regularly. The apps that open automatically, the accounts you follow without thinking, the habits so old you've forgotten you ever chose them. These defaults, left unexamined, quietly determine an enormous share of your daily mental diet. Periodically auditing them, the same way you might periodically review a budget, keeps your mental environment aligned with who you're actually trying to become, rather than drifting toward whoever's loudest and closest at hand. None of this requires perfection or extreme minimalism. It simply requires treating your daily environment as a variable you control, rather than a backdrop you passively accept. Small structural changes, compounded over months, tend to matter more than any single dramatic overhaul. When the detox gets hard, it would be dishonest to end this audiobook without addressing the moments when this work stops feeling inspiring and starts feeling genuinely difficult, because those moments will come, and pretending otherwise sets you up to quit. The first time reality doesn't match the highlight reel of transformation. There will be a Tuesday, 3 weeks into your new habits, when none of it feels like it's working. You'll wake up just as tired as before. A conversation will trigger the exact same defensive reaction you thought you'd already worked through. You'll catch yourself scrolling mindlessly for 45 minutes, despite every intention otherwise. In that moment, a very loud, very convincing voice will tell you this entire process is pointless, that you're the exception, that whatever worked for other people simply isn't built for someone like you. That voice is not evidence. It's the old wiring defending its territory, the way any established system defends against being replaced. The fact that it's loud doesn't make it accurate. It often just means the rewiring is actually starting to threaten a pattern that's been comfortable for a very long time. Consider James, a small business owner in Nashville who did everything right for the first 2 weeks of a mental reset. Clean information diet, morning meditation, honest self-talk, and then hit a genuinely brutal month where a major client walked away and cash flow tightened overnight. His first instinct was to abandon every new habit entirely, reasoning that clearly none of it had actually protected him from disaster. But when he talked it through with a mentor, the real picture came into focus. The habits hadn't prevented a hard month from happening. Nothing could have. But they were the reason he handled that hard month without spiraling into the kind of despair that would have made rebuilding even harder. The detox wasn't a shield against difficulty. It was the reason difficulty didn't flatten him. This distinction matters enormously. Mental detox was never sold to you in this audiobook as a guarantee that life gets easy. It's a guarantee that you get stronger, steadier under pressure, clearer during confusion, more resilient after setbacks. Some days that strength will be obvious. Other days it will be invisible, quietly doing its job in the background while everything still feels hard. When you hit a genuinely difficult stretch, resist 2 opposite temptations. The first is quitting entirely, deciding the whole framework failed because one hard week happened. The second is forcing relentless positivity, refusing to acknowledge the real difficulty in front of you. Neither serves you. The better path is simpler and less dramatic. Acknowledge the hard thing honestly. Keep the small daily practices running even imperfectly, and trust that consistency during difficulty is worth more than consistency during ease, precisely because it's harder to maintain. It also helps enormously to lower the bar for what counts as success on the hardest days. A 5-minute meditation instead of 20 still counts. A single gratitude note before an exhausted collapse into bed still counts. Showing up imperfectly again and again builds far more durable change than showing up perfectly for 2 weeks and then disappearing entirely when life gets complicated. A final walkthrough before you begin. Before this audiobook ends, let's walk through exactly what the next 21 days can look like in practice so you're not left with theory alone. On day 1, before anything else, spend 15 minutes with a notebook, answering the assessment questions from Chapter 3 honestly. Not for anyone else's benefit, for yours. This becomes your baseline, the before picture you'll be able to look back on in 3 weeks and genuinely appreciate. Choose one clear boundary to set with your information environment today. Maybe that's deleting a single app. Maybe it's turning off notifications entirely for a week. Pick something specific and doable rather than an overwhelming all-or-nothing overhaul that collapses under its own weight by day 3. Identify, honestly, one relationship in your life that consistently leaves you feeling drained and one that consistently leaves you feeling stronger. You don't need to act on this immediately. Simply naming it clearly is often the first real step toward eventually rebalancing where your time and energy go. Each morning for the next week, before reaching for your phone, take 5 slow breaths and ask yourself a single question. What does today actually need from me? Not what does your inbox need, not what does social media need. What do you specifically need to focus on to move your actual life forward? Each evening, spend 2 minutes writing down one thing that went well and one honest lesson from anything that didn't. This isn't about performance or positivity. It's about training your mind to notice both progress and useful feedback, rather than default into either denial or despair. By day 7, revisit your notebook. You likely won't feel transformed yet, and that's expected. Remember the resistance phase from Chapter 10. The goal this week was never transformation. It was simply proving to yourself that you can follow through on small commitments to your own mind, the same way you'd follow through on commitments to your body. In week 2, begin actively replacing what you removed: a book instead of a scroll, a real conversation instead of a passive feed, a walk instead of a screen. In week 3, return to your limiting beliefs from Chapter 5 and Chapter 7 and begin the work of building genuine counter-evidence and new, more accurate replacement beliefs. By day 21, you won't be finished. Nobody ever fully is. But you'll have real, lived proof that your mind is not fixed, that the patterns running your life can be identified and changed, and that you are fully capable of doing the work required to change them. That proof, once you have it, cannot be taken away from you. It becomes part of your own permanent evidence file, the exact opposite of the limiting beliefs you started with. Everything in this audiobook comes down to one simple, repeatable truth. Your mind, like your body, responds to how you treat it. Neglect it, and it grows cluttered, reactive, and weak. Tend to it consistently and honestly, and it grows clear, resilient, and strong. The tools are not complicated. The science is not mysterious. The only real variable left is whether you choose to begin. The stories we never question. Every culture hands its members a set of default stories about what a good life looks like, and most people spend decades chasing those stories without ever pausing to ask whether the story was actually theirs to begin with. Consider the story of constant productivity, the quiet, pervasive belief that your worth is measured by how much you accomplish, how full your calendar looks, how exhausted you are by the end of a successful day. This story didn't arrive by accident. It's reinforced by workplaces that reward visible busyness over actual results, by social feeds that showcase other people's output rather than their rest, and by a culture that often treats slowing down as a moral failing rather than a biological necessity. Then there's the story of arrival, the idea that happiness exists on the other side of some future milestone. Once you get the promotion, you'll relax. Once the mortgage is paid off, you'll feel secure. Once the relationship reaches a certain stage, you'll finally feel settled. This story keeps people running toward a horizon that, by design, keeps receding the moment they get close, because the mind that built the story is the same mind that will find the next milestone to chase once the current one is reached. There's also the story of external validation, the quiet assumption that your value needs to be confirmed by someone else's approval before it counts. Likes, promotions, praise from a parent who's difficult to please, recognition from people whose opinion you've never actually examined for whether it deserves the weight you've given it. This story is exhausting precisely because it can never be fully satisfied. There is always one more person whose approval hasn't yet been secured. None of these stories are entirely false. Productivity matters. Milestones matter. Other people's feedback matters. The problem isn't that these things have value. It's that, left unexamined, they quietly become the entire foundation of a person's self-worth, rather than one input among many. Detoxing your mind eventually means going beyond individual negative thoughts and beliefs into the larger stories underneath them. Ask yourself, honestly, what story about a good life did I absorb before I ever had the chance to choose it deliberately? Whose definition of success am I actually chasing? If I stripped away every external measure, title, income, approval, comparison, what would actually feel meaningful to me on a quiet Tuesday with nobody watching? These aren't quick questions with tidy answers, but simply asking them, honestly and repeatedly, begins to loosen stories that have been running unquestioned for years, sometimes decades. And once a story is questioned, it stops operating with the same silent, automatic authority it once had over your choices. The compound effect of a clear mind. It's worth ending with a clear picture of why any of this matters beyond simply feeling better on any given day. Because the real payoff of mental detox isn't a single good mood. It's what a consistently clear mind compounds into over years. Think about decision quality. Every significant outcome in a life, career direction, relationships, health, finances, traces back to a long series of decisions made along the way. A mind clouded by anxiety, comparison, and reactive emotion tends to make decisions from fear, urgency, or a need for quick relief. A clear mind tends to make decisions from genuine values and longer-term thinking. Multiply that difference across hundreds of decisions over a decade, and the gap between two otherwise similar people can become enormous, not because one was luckier, but because one was thinking more clearly at every fork in the road. Think about relationships. A person carrying constant insecurity, comparison, or unprocessed resentment tends to bring that weight into every interaction, whether consciously or not, reading rejection into neutral comments, needing constant reassurance, struggling to fully trust even genuinely good people. A person operating from a cleaner mental baseline tends to show up more securely, communicate more directly, and build relationships that are easier for both sides to sustain. This doesn't happen because clear-minded people are naturally more likable. It happens because they've removed the noise that used to distort ordinary interactions into something heavier than they needed to be. Think about resilience during genuine hardship, which every life eventually includes regardless of how well you've prepared. A mind already practiced at observing thoughts rather than being consumed by them, already equipped with a toolkit for reframing and emotional regulation, tends to move through real crisis with more stability than a mind encountering these skills for the first time in the middle of a genuine emergency. The work you do now, on an ordinary day when nothing in particular is wrong, is precisely what determines how you'll handle the day when something eventually is. And think, finally, about the years themselves. A mind spent mostly reactive, anxious, and scattered experiences a life very differently than a mind spent mostly clear, intentional, and present, even when the external circumstances of both lives look remarkably similar from the outside. Two people can have comparable jobs, comparable families, comparable bank accounts, and experience those exact same years in profoundly different ways, depending entirely on the quality of the mind they're living through them with. This is the real case for everything covered in this audiobook. Not a better mood today, though that will come too. A fundamentally different trajectory, compounding quietly across years, built from thousands of small, ordinary choices about what you let into your mind and what you choose to remove from it. You now have the map, the 5 infections to watch for, the honest assessment to return to whenever you need recalibration, the 21-day protocol to reset a polluted baseline, the deeper belief work to rewrite the operating system underneath your daily thoughts, the daily practices to keep it clean once it's clear. None of it requires perfection. All of it requires beginning. Starting tomorrow morning, everything in this audiobook has built toward a single, unglamorous moment. Tomorrow morning, when your alarm goes off and you have to decide, in the first 60 seconds of the day, whether any of this actually changes how you live. It won't be a dramatic moment. There won't be music swelling in the background, no clear before and after split screen the way transformation gets packaged in movies. It will look like reaching for a book instead of a phone. It will look like noticing a comparison thought and naming it instead of believing it automatically. It will look like 5 slow breaths instead of an immediate reach for distraction. Small, quiet, almost invisible choices, repeated enough times to eventually become who you are. Think back to Rachel from Denver, the marketing manager with 90 open tabs in her mind. 6 months after she started her own version of this process, nothing about her external circumstances had changed dramatically. Same job, same condo, same mountain view. What changed was the quality of the mind she carried through all of it. She described the shift to a friend not as suddenly feeling happy all the time, but as finally feeling like she was living her life instead of just managing a constant low-grade emergency inside her own head. The tabs closed, one at a time, until the browser felt usable again. Think back to Marcus, the firefighter in Phoenix who once described his mind as static, caught between 2 stations. A year into a deliberate information diet, regular training in attention and emotional regulation, and honest work on the beliefs he'd absorbed long before he ever put on a uniform, he described his baseline as simply quieter. Not silent, never silent, but quieter, with enough space between a thought and a reaction that he finally felt like he was driving instead of being dragged along. Neither of them became a different person. They became a clearer version of the person they already were, with years of accumulated static finally cleared away. That is the entire promise of everything covered here. Not a new identity, but an unobstructed one. You'll notice, if you're honest, that very little of what's been covered in this audiobook is complicated. Reduce what pollutes your mind. Add what genuinely nourishes it. Question the beliefs and stories you never chose consciously. Build daily habits that maintain the clarity once you've found it. None of it requires special talent, expensive tools, or rare circumstances. It requires only a decision, repeated daily, to treat your mind with the same seriousness you already give your body. So here is the final, simple instruction, more important than anything else in this entire audiobook. Pick one thing. Not everything covered here. One thing. One boundary, one habit, one belief worth questioning. Start there, tomorrow morning, before the day has a chance to fill itself with everything except what actually matters. Everything else the 21 days, the deeper belief work, the long-term maintenance, builds naturally from that first, small, deliberate choice. The mind you'll have a year from now is being built, quietly, out of choices exactly this size, made or skipped, one ordinary morning at a time. A word on patience and a word on urgency. There are two opposite mistakes people make when they first encounter a framework like this one, and it's worth naming both clearly before you close this audiobook and step back into your actual life. The first mistake is treating the whole thing as urgent, deciding that because the stakes feel high, every piece of it needs to be implemented immediately, tonight, all at once. This almost always backfires. A person who deletes every app, overhauls every relationship, and rewrites every belief in a single week is not practicing mental detox. They're practicing an adrenaline-driven overcorrection that rarely survives contact with an ordinary Tuesday 2 weeks later. Once the initial burst of motivation has worn off and old patterns quietly start creeping back in through the cracks left by an unsustainable pace. The second mistake is treating the whole thing as leisurely, nodding along, agreeing it all sounds reasonable, and then never actually starting, waiting for some future version of life that feels calmer, less busy, more convenient. That version of life rarely arrives on its own. There is always a reasonable excuse to wait one more week, one more month, one more year. And each of those delays is simply more time spent operating on the same polluted baseline this entire audiobook has been describing. The right pace sits between those two extremes, urgent enough to actually begin today in some small concrete way, rather than filing this away as something to think about later. Patient enough to accept that real rewiring takes weeks and months, not a single dramatic weekend. And that setbacks along the way are simply part of the process, rather than evidence it isn't working. Think of it the way you'd think about physical training. Nobody expects to walk into a gym once and wake up transformed the next morning. Nobody abandons an entire fitness plan because one workout felt harder than expected. The same reasonable, patient, consistent mindset applies here. Start now. Expect a real timeline, and trust the compounding effect of small, repeated effort over any single moment of dramatic intensity. Whatever page of life you're on right now, however cluttered, however polluted, however far from where you want to be, the starting point doesn't need to be impressive. It only needs to be real, and it only needs to happen today. The choice, from here, is entirely yours.